In the Northern Air Temple, we are introduced to the Mechanist and his community of refugees. He and his people lost their original home in a flood, and so relocated to a wonderful, whimsical place he discovered, with walls covered in marvelous flying men with wild contraptions. They settled in the Northern Air Temple, the previous home of the air nomads, not because it was their only option, because they found it useful and interesting. And so, they have taken the air nomad technology, cultural relics, and home, and appropriated it for their needs. There's a lot of good, and even beauty in what the Mechanist is doing. He has redesigned the technology to make glider flight accessible to anyone. He's created fertile soil for new people to enjoy and participate in the spirit of the airbenders. And he has created a home that many well-intentioned people have found comfort and community within. But in doing so, he has communicated a willingness to loot the air people's culture for whatever he can make use of, even in the face of a living and breathing air nomad protesting. He discarded the roots of the air nomad's cultural practices while taking what he found novel and curious. There's a clear sense of entitlement in him to access even the most private and sacred aspects of the air nomads. And worst of all of this is actually in service of strengthening the imperialistic forces that committed genocide on the air nomads in the first place. The Mechanist is building weapons of war for the Fire Nation, the very people who killed the air nomads. The Mechanist is not acting out of a racist contempt for the air people, far from it. He clearly sees value in and appreciates a lot of their culture, but he approaches it with a willingness to discard what's inconvenient and take what he wants. This is a colonial mindset, which is demonstrably compatible with the goals of the Fire Nation itself, and imperialism more broadly. You're probably familiar with this practice by another name though: cultural appropriation. Which brings us to the topic of this video. Is Avatar doing cultural appropriation in how it uses indigenous and Asian cultures? Let's talk about that. Okay, first, let's just get everybody up to speed on what I'm even talking about here. Cultural appropriation is the practice of looting cultural iconography in a way that upholds unequal relationships between those cultures. This is what separates it from vanilla racism. Redskin mascots and Halloween costumes aren't merely offensive. They also signal that indigenous people are something you can treat as tropes, like they're werewolves, and see as less than a full human being. In the context of media and television, that means reducing a colonized culture to a collection of tropes and signifiers to commodify, which accomplishes a couple things. One, it signals to their audience to relate to that culture as an othered spectacle. It uses their presentation to alienate them further from the dominant culture. It furthers existing misunderstandings about those people, and it communicates the right to take and sanitize the aspects of that culture that you find convenient and marketable, without the accompanying responsibility or acknowledgement. Over time, this practice has rightfully developed a very strong negative connotation, as it's something media should absolutely avoid the best it can. But to a point, the negative connotation has taken on a life of its own, and transformed how we use the term from an analysis of how Western media subtly positions themselves as superior to the marginalized, into a word that describes all instances of racism or even discomfort a marginalized person experiences. So, it's also important to remember that not all poorly executed cultural borrowing is a form of social violence. For example, some of it is cringe.
Who let the dogs out? Who?
For the purposes of this video though, cultural appropriation is, specifically, a form of analysis in how tropes and choices subtly reinforce a colonial way of understanding a marginalized culture. That snappy definition doesn't make identifying this stuff simple though, given it's largely a subconscious process from growing up immersed in this stuff. And especially in a globalized project like Avatar: The Last Airbender, reducing the analysis to insiders and outsiders risks essentialism and disenfranchisement. But I hope we can at least agree that this is a practice that we wish to avoid. And as we'll see, the show clearly agrees that it's a practice best avoided as well. Okay, I'm gonna stop bearing the lead here. Avatar is really, really good at this stuff in general. If cultural appropriation reduces a culture to a collection of commodified tropes and signifiers, Avatar, especially for its time, radically took steps against these norms in a couple of very, very intelligent ways. One huge way that they managed to avoid offensive generalizations about Asian and indigenous cultures was through premising the story on a plurality of perspectives. They mitigate potential generalization and harm by avoiding a singular Asian monoculture altogether. By showing multiple sides to a conflict, all from an Asian perspective, it leaves the audience unable to reduce that perspective to a convenient simplification. The series also does well narratively to make this a fully Asian world, without a white equivalent. The lack of white protagonists to anchor the narrative forces viewers to see themselves through the eyes of Asian and indigenous people, and also leaves nothing exotic about the presentation of those cultures, as all the POV characters grow up within their world and came to treat their cultural elements as normal. Further, the series itself remaps our geographical assumptions around these Asian-inspired nations as the front and center, rather than as a faraway Orient. Not having white characters also lets them sidestep the difficulty involved in trying to translate whiteness, while having a story actively about colonialism, and avoid making problematic comments on real-life relationships between white people and those they historically have colonized. Alright, next up, ambiguity. While all the nations have primary inspirations, they are purposely a blend of many at once. This, mostly, lets them get away with not explicitly making a commentary on one specific real-life race or culture.
You want to be inspired without appropriating. You don't want to accidentally say something about a culture. For example, early on, a lot of the designs for the Fire Nation were inspired by designs from Japan, which was a problem. You had a bad nation, and if all of their designs were Japanese, you'd project a poor message about their culture.
While the series strives for an accurate representation in their writing, clothing, and architecture, it balances this with making each nation clearly unique and creatively independent. Behind the scenes, they also, critically, hired a ton of consultants. Cultural consultants are studied in the ways that cultures are misrepresented, and often personally familiar with the harm misrepresentation can cause. Hiring people who are invested in avoiding these media tendencies goes a long way towards identifying them in advance. For example, Avatar's primary cultural consultant was Edwin Zane, who was literally the former VP of the Media Action Network for Asian Americans. Nowadays, this is practically industry standard, with sensitivity readers. Most shows you love nowadays probably employ them to try to avoid stepping on rakes. A related but slightly distinct point is openly talking about the efforts you take. Avatar wears its inspirations on its sleeve, and that's for the good of everyone involved. Actively publicizing the work you do behind the scenes to take a culture seriously itself diffuses some of the potential harm by showing that this isn't an entirely one-sided exchange between the powerful and the powerless, and that informed participants do have input and contribution. It also cites your sources and gives credit where it's due towards an audience unfamiliar with the culture and their history. This invites curiosity and appreciation rather than appropriation. The bending styles being inspired by different forms of martial arts is a good example of openly crediting your inspirations in a way that fosters positive interest. And finally, and probably most critically, the story itself actively rejects a ton of racist tropes and practices. Let's just start naming them off. Their voice director Romano prohibited white actors from mimicking non-white accents. The story rejects a colonial binary between a culture being modern or authentic. It rejects portraying indigenous environmentalism as romanticized, unchanging tradition. It rejects simplification and portrays characters at unusual intersections of race, class, gender, and disabilities, as well as showing that conflicts fall along these lines, even within oppressed cultures. It rejects and challenges pre-existing stereotypes on cultural scripts. And despite heavily centering the threat of colonial extinction in the story, they managed to mostly dodge the vanishing natives trope of treating the extinction of natives as inevitable, and go so far as to portray the opposite, their adaptation and survival, as a successful act of resistance itself. We take a lot of this stuff for granted nowadays, but Avatar premiered in 2005. This was 2 years after the dumpster fire that was Brother Bear. The fact that they managed to pull this off, and further even showed how commercially successful doing so can be, is something worth acclaim. More than just tokenism, the story itself is one about these people living under brutal colonization, striving to reclaim themselves and fight back against their oppressor. That is powerful. And look, I'm a lefty boy. I know we like to dunk on representation as just immaterial lip service. But this stuff really does matter. And good representation really does have the power to shape people's imagination of what they're capable of. That doesn't make Avatar any less of a story told by white people. This isn't marginalized people getting to tell their own story, but it's still something excellent. And for the time, dare I say, revolutionary in the scope of mainstream representation. It trailblazed for a generation of television that resists racist assumptions and fetishizing outsider culture. This isn't the full picture though. While certainly groundbreaking, Avatar was not perfect about this, and a lot of contrary voices on the topic don't get spotlighted much. I don't necessarily agree with all of these positions, or even think they necessarily fall under cultural appropriation directly. But rather than litigate that myself, I'd rather just present them as something to examine. And if nothing else, maybe raise some questions about what you did or didn't notice at the time. Let's start with probably the most obvious thing. The primary vocal cast is very, very white. The topic of racial representation in voice acting is complicated, with a lot of opinions about it, but it's certainly interesting that given how much fury was raised over the accursed movies whitewashing its cast, that the animated series' cast being predominantly white has received relatively little attention. If you want a more deep dive into the arguments around representation in voice acting, check out this video. But look, I gotta say, there's a difference between celebrating Asian culture and actually celebrating Asian people. It's just true that in a production that yoinks heavily from indigenous culture, indigenous people were not given the space to voice themselves. Behind the scenes information still informs the impact of appropriative elements, and the voice cast just isn't a place where efforts were made to counter the prevailing winds. And it leaves a lot of room for arguments that the white actors must have just been meritocratically superior, despite the huge amount of existing barriers to break into these roles. The debate over this stuff is largely old hat now. Even Disney at this point is beginning to make a point of having stories about minorities have casts that represent that. So it's possible that they might do things differently now that the norms have moved on from where they were at that time. Okay, next up, monks. While the series celebrates Asian cultures as diverse and complex most of the time, they have their blind spots. Namely, their honestly pretty surface level and stereotype-ridden portrayal of air nomads. Or, should I say, Tibetan monks. While efforts were made to draw on a diversity of inspirations for the series, the air nomads are still overwhelmingly inspired by Tibetan monks. Specifically, inspired by Western misconceptions about them. The idea Tibetan Buddhism is all about egalitarianism and pacifism is an error widespread in Western culture, thanks in part to New Age counterculture movements of the 1960s, think hippies, and the celebritization of Buddhist leaders as advocates for peace, like the 14th Dalai Lama. Particularly egregious in the association with Zen Buddhism rather than Tibetan Buddhism. There is an infantilization here in portraying essentially all of the stereotypes of Tibetan monks in the Air Nomads. That they were pure-hearted, peace-loving magic men living in isolation. That they were vegetarians in a fully equal society. The portrayal of the Air Nomads does nothing but reinforce Western stereotypes and misconceptions about these people, which is something that they largely took enormous efforts to avoid with the Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom. Now, there's a couple counter-arguments you could make to this. Like that the Air Nomads just didn't have time in the original series to be explored. Or that they are drawing from multiple inspirations, and just because one of those inspirations is the very clear dominant one, that doesn't mean it's responsible for how it portrays them. But if we're arguing that they just took elements of a culture that suited them without the attached responsibility, then that is textbook cultural appropriation. We'll get back to the Air Nomads later. Unfortunately, it's not just the Air Nomads. Their broader portrayal of indigenous culture is often pretty surface level and lacking. Yeah, they put a lot of care into specifically portraying East Asian culture, but comparatively little for the indigenous water tribes. Like the Air Nomads, very little is done to muddy the reading of them as just directly analogous to circumpolar indigenous people. Especially in the Southern Water Tribe, where most of their cultural elements are just directly lifted from them, which leads to the representational inconsistencies coming across more as not doing the research, rather than suggesting its intentional ambiguity. Much of the tribe's practices are an incorrect depiction of Inuit science, and the tribe's fearful attitude towards Aang treats those members like they're just some scared animals. In general, there is a failure here to involve indigenous actors and creatives at a level comparable to their Asian counterparts, and it gives the impression that they just wanted to borrow the aesthetic without giving the depth afforded to the other tribes in their world. Water tribe names, for example, at first are largely absent of any circumpolar inspiration, unlike the other nations which draw on the relevant cultural name roots. It's also a shame that they portray water tribe food as disgusting. This is a very common trope of alienating indigenous people. The lazy world building is less of an issue in the northern tribe at least, which does have a diversity of inspirations that make it more ambiguous and fleshed out. Its patriarchal system, European waterways, and Chinese princess are clearly not circumpolar. Although, still, it's a bit of a missed opportunity, no? Not to develop the circumpolar inspirations when they finally had time to in the northern tribe. Alright, let's take a swerve. We gotta talk about accents. I mentioned earlier that they had a policy not to have non-white actors imitate accents. But they still had accents. The most extreme example, at least to me, comes in Guru Pathik, the show's only South Asian coded character, who was given a very thick Indian accent, which is not the actor's natural speaking voice. Pathik as a whole is bizarre. He exists solely as a Magic Man plot device to help the spiritual awakening of the protagonist, before vanishing, never to be seen again. Oh, well, except for that one time.
Chakras! Chakras! Chakra sandwich is good. Yum!
Yeah, I think that speaks for itself. Given how heavily the show draws from Hinduism, this depiction of their only South Asian character is incredibly careless. He is riddled with racist Indian tropes and should not have existed in the form we got him. Still, there is an argument that his accent at least is not the problem. The series often uses accents to signal aged wisdom. It's not just him. So this is at least consistent with that decision. And that decision itself is not overtly racist. Except in the other instances where they use accents, it's meant to signal negative traits. The show often uses accents to communicate fraudulence or tackiness to the audience. In the Earth Kingdom, characters are given Chinese accents to suggest a fakeness to them. Master Yu, an earthbending teacher handing out coupon sales, has a prominent accent, as does Tong, the silly, cowardly mayor of Avatar Day, who holds a kangaroo court. Even if comedy is not explicitly derived from their accents, and I'm not sure that it isn't, accents are still being used to other them. Accents also come to represent frustrating bureaucrats in Ba Sing Se. Both the customs officer, who rejects the refugees from entering the city, and Zhou Di, the woman who obstructs the gang's every effort once within the city, have prominent accents. Regardless of intent, this coding decision is harmful. Okay. Last one. Let's cycle back to the air nomads, okay? So, if you didn't know, the complete genocide of the peaceful Air Nation by the technologically advanced Fire Nation seems a very direct representation of the invasion and occupancy of Tibet by the People's Republic of China in 1959. This is not ambiguous. Not enough has been done to separate the air nomads from Tibet. That the show is referencing the death of millions of Tibetans through murder, warfare, and pillaging, Tibetans whose families are still alive right now, still being oppressed? If unintentional, it's extremely thoughtless, and if intentional, is deeply irresponsible. Tibet has no freedom of speech, mass internet and media censorship, prison torture, they suffer forced assimilation. The Tibetan population numbers have been dwindling and threatened with cultural extinction. This isn't the only time the show pulls this crap either. Again, they sprinkle in recent traumatic history in Lake Laogai, which is named after a real, effectively still existing, Chinese prison camp system that holds hundreds of thousands of people China wants to make disappear. They use starvation, slave labor, there's evidence that there's organ harvesting. They are a form of death camp. Imagine the creators named it Lake Auschwitz, and I think that might help clue in how extremely poor taste this is. Especially given that these references aren't being used in any way that actually serves the people suffering under these things. People who, again, are still alive including Tibetans locked up in the system. The ongoing Tibetan self-immolation is a direct result of these genocidal practices being protested to the current day, as that's the only way they can ever hope to get media attention on the subject. People are literally setting themselves on fire to grab a scrap of recognition of what's going on. So, maybe there is a place to use the show to elevate the struggles of these people. But making it an Easter egg footnote for the trivia section of a wiki isn't it. If you're going to touch on these things, do it in a way that actually serves to empower their real, actual struggle. Compare this to how they treated bending and its martial arts inspirations. Everyone who's a fan of the show knows what that's based off of. Everyone knows the inspiration for bending. But most fans of the show, I'd wager, don't recognize the connection to the Tibetan genocide, let alone have the show encourage public curiosity. Of course, it's very likely that the network itself would never allow them to draw attention to that. As far as I'm aware, they haven't even acknowledged it in their art books. But you see, this is exactly the system of how appropriation works. It takes what it wants without the accompanied inconvenient bits, and sanitizes it in a way that can be used conveniently to shape how people understand these issues. And it does communicate to these people, Tibetans who watch the show, a willingness to directly use their struggle as an aesthetic. In the Northern Air Temple, it wasn't enough to just appreciate the cultures they were borrowing from. The Mechanist and his people had to reorient their entire project of borrowing from one that passively upheld imperialism to one that actively fought against it. It's up to you to make up your own judgment on the nuance of where Avatar falls on this. I'm just here to present some viewpoints that I think are criminally underrepresented. But I would like to encourage you to resist deifying Avatar as a flawless masterpiece. And if you're someone who doesn't see this stuff as a big deal, there's maybe something to interrogate there. Is it really that these issues are small? Or is it that we've been taught by media to treat their needs as disposable? I still love Avatar: The Last Airbender, and from that love, I just want us to be able to talk about where it could have done better. Alright friends, I'll leave you there. Last note though, to avoid being a hypocrite, I did have a couple of cultural consultants and a bunch of sources. Special shout out to 2 Tumblr accounts, at ATLA Culture and Mostly Mundane ATLA. Be sure to check them both out. Also, thank you, Kuro from the Ink Tank, for providing his voice. All links below. Also my links too, if you want to follow me around the internet. Each of these videos takes a month of effort, so if you enjoy the work I do, it does mean a lot to subscribe. Okay, but for real, take care.